In 1913, Argentina was one of the 10 wealthiest nations on Earth. Its per capita income was higher than France, higher than Germany, higher than Italy, higher than Spain. Buenos Aires was called the Paris of South America, and this was not marketing. It was accurate. The architecture was French. The boulevards were wide and tree-lined. The opera house rivaled anything in Europe. The cattle ranches of the Pampas were feeding half the world. The wheat fields of the interior were among the most productive on the planet. Argentine beef was the standard by which all beef was measured. Argentine grain filled the holds of ships bound for every major port in the world. A British economist writing in 1913 would have told you, with complete confidence, that Argentina was on trajectory to become one of the great industrial powers of the 20th century. The natural resources were extraordinary. The agricultural capacity was matched only by America and Australia. The immigrant population arriving from Italy, Spain, and Eastern Europe was educated, motivated, and entrepreneurial. The country had stable institutions, a functioning legal system, and a currency backed by gold. The future looked, to any reasonable observer, like a guarantee. That economist would have been the most spectacularly wrong forecaster in the history of economic prediction, because in the century that followed, Argentina did not become a great industrial power. It did not follow the trajectory of Australia or Canada or the United States, other settler nations with comparable natural endowments and immigrant-driven populations. Instead, Argentina became something unique in modern economic history. A country that has defaulted on its national debt 9 times. A country that has experienced hyperinflation, so severe that prices doubled every few weeks. A country where the peso has been replaced, redenominated, devalued, or completely reinvented so many times that Argentines have largely stopped trusting their own currency and have for decades measured their real wealth in American dollars hidden under mattresses and in safety deposit boxes in Uruguay and Miami. In 2001, Argentina experienced the largest sovereign debt default in history at the time. 5 presidents resigned in 2 weeks. The government froze all bank accounts in an operation they called the Corralito, meaning the little fence, as if the savings of ordinary Argentines were livestock to be penned. People who had worked their entire lives and saved responsibly went to the bank one morning and found the fence around their money. Riots erupted. People died. A country of 40 million educated, sophisticated, passionate people watched their financial system collapse in real time. And then, in the years that followed, Argentina repeated the same mistakes. Different names, same playbook. Print money, spend beyond revenues, borrow from external creditors, fail to repay, impose capital controls, watch the currency collapse. Repeat. In 2023, annual inflation in Argentina reached 211%. Not a typo. 211%. The price of a loaf of bread that cost 100 pesos in January cost 311 pesos by December. The peso lost more than 2/3 of its purchasing power in a single year. And the response to this catastrophe was to elect the most radical leader in Argentina's history, a man who came to office wielding a chainsaw as a literal campaign prop, promising to dollarize the economy, eliminate the central bank, and chainsaw the entire apparatus of the Argentine state. This is not a country that has been unlucky. This is not a country that lacked resources or human capital or geographic advantages. This is a country that has done this to itself repeatedly, following a pattern so consistent and so well documented that economists have given it a specific name, the Argentine paradox, or more bluntly, the suicide loop. Today, we are going to go inside the loop. We are going to trace it from its origins in the golden age of the late 19th century through every collapse, every recovery, every repeat of the same catastrophic pattern, to the extraordinary present moment where Argentina is attempting something that has never been tried at this scale. We're going to understand not just what happened, but why it keeps happening, what structural, cultural, and political forces keep driving a country with every advantage towards self-destruction. And at the end, we're going to talk about what Argentina teaches all of us about money, about inflation, about the relationship between citizens and their governments, and about how ordinary people protect themselves when the system fails. Buckle up. This is the most extraordinary economic story of the 20th and 21st centuries, and it is not over. To understand the depth of Argentina's fall, you have to understand how high it once stood. And we are not talking about a modest level of prosperity. We are talking about genuine first world wealth by any measure of the era. The period from roughly 1880 to 1930 is known in Argentina as the Belle Epoque, and the name is deserved. Argentina's economy during this period grew at rates that rivaled the United States. The country was attracting massive amounts of British capital investment. Railways were being built across the Pampas. Refrigerated ships were being developed specifically to carry Argentine beef to European markets. The invention of refrigerated maritime transport, which happened in 1876, essentially created the modern Argentine beef export industry and made Argentina wealthy almost overnight. The Pampas, the vast, fertile grassland that covers an area roughly the size of Western Europe, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of agricultural real estate on the planet. The soil is deep, the rainfall adequate, the climate temperate. Cattle grow fat with almost no intervention. Wheat and corn grow in profusion. Argentina in the late 19th century was, in terms of agricultural endowment, the most gifted nation on earth after the United States. And immigrants arrived to work it. Between 1880 and 1930, approximately 6.6 million immigrants came to Argentina, primarily from Italy and Spain. These were not people fleeing poverty and arriving with nothing. Many were skilled craftsmen, merchants, farmers, and entrepreneurs who brought exactly the human capital that a developing agricultural economy needed. The Italian community, in particular, built extraordinary institutions, their own banks, their own newspapers, their own schools, their own cultural organizations. By 1913, Argentina's per capita GDP was comparable to that of France and higher than that of Sweden, which was beginning its own extraordinary development trajectory. Argentina was the world's largest exporter of beef, corn, and linseed. It was the fifth largest exporter of wheat. Buenos Aires was one of the great cities of the world, with a subway system more modern than those of many European capitals, an architecture of extraordinary ambition, and a cultural life that produced world-class literature, music, and intellectual discourse. The political system, by the standard of the era, was functioning. The 1912 Signs Paint a Law introduced universal male suffrage and the secret ballot, a democratic advance that placed Argentina ahead of many European countries. The Radical Civil Union, the first genuinely mass political party in Argentine history, came to power in 1916 under Hipólito Yrigoyen, a charismatic figure who represented the first genuine transfer of power from the old landowning elite to a broader middle-class democratic coalition. So what went wrong? The first answer is commodity dependence. Argentina's extraordinary wealth was almost entirely based on agricultural exports: beef, wheat, corn, wool. This was wealth extracted from the land by relatively few people and exported to Europe. It was not the wealth of industrialization, of manufacturing, of a diversified economy. When commodity prices fell, as they did dramatically after World War I, and catastrophically during the Great Depression, Argentina's revenues collapsed. The second answer is the nature of its elite, the landowning class. The estancieros who owned the great cattle ranches and wheat farms of the Pampas were not industrial capitalists with an interest in developing domestic manufacturing. They were rentiers who extracted wealth from land and exported it. They had no interest in tariffs that would have protected domestic industry, because tariffs would have raised the prices of the imported manufactured goods they consumed. The Argentine economy was organized from its inception around exporting raw materials and importing finished goods, a model that created wealth for a few, employed relatively few workers, and left the broader population dependent on wages in an economy with limited industrial development. The third answer, and perhaps the most important, is the structural role of the state that emerged from the Argentine experience. Argentina's federal government, from its earliest days, was understood by all political actors not as a neutral arbiter of rules, but as a prize to be captured. Whoever controlled the federal government controlled the tariff, the currency, the patronage system, the public employment that was the economic lifeblood of many communities. Politics in Argentina was not about competing visions of the common good. It was about capturing the state and distributing its resources to your coalition. This pattern, once established, proved extraordinarily durable. The Great Depression hit Argentina with devastating force. Between 1929 and 1932, Argentine export earnings fell by more than 40%. The government's tax revenues, which depended heavily on trade, collapsed. The British pound left the gold standard in 1931, and Argentina, whose trade and financial relationships were overwhelmingly with Britain, faced a currency crisis. In 1930, Argentina's first military coup since the 19th century overthrew Uruguayan's democratically elected government, inaugurating a pattern of military intervention in politics that would persist with interruptions for the next 5 decades. The Golden Age was over. What replaced it would prove to be something much more complicated, much more painful, and much more instructive. No figure in Argentine history is more important, more controversial, or more responsible for the structural economic problems that persist to this day than one Domingo Perón. He was a military officer who came to prominence in the 1943 coup, became Minister of Labor, built a mass political movement through the labor unions, was briefly imprisoned by his rivals in the military, and was rescued from prison by a massive popular demonstration in October 1945 organized in part by his charismatic companion Eva Duarte, who would become the world-famous Evita. Perón was elected president in 1946 by an enormous margin. He governed until 1955, when he was overthrown by another military coup. He went into exile for 18 years, returned to Argentina briefly, died in office in 1974, and even today, the political movement he created divides Argentina more profoundly than any other force in the country's history. The two dominant political coalitions in contemporary Argentina are effectively the Peronists and the anti-Peronists. For 70 years, this binary has structured Argentine politics in ways that would be extraordinary in any other country. The Pampas, the vast, fertile grassland that covers an area roughly the size of Western Europe, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of agricultural real estate on the planet. The soil is deep, the rainfall adequate, the climate temperate. Cattle grow fat with almost no intervention. Wheat and corn grow in profusion. Argentina in the late 19th century was, in terms of agricultural endowment, the most gifted nation on earth after the United States. And immigrants arrived to work it. Between 1880 and 1930, approximately 6.6 million immigrants came to Argentina, primarily from Italy and Spain. These were not people fleeing poverty and arriving with nothing. Many were skilled craftsmen, merchants, farmers, and entrepreneurs who brought exactly the human capital that a developing agricultural economy needed. The Italian community, in particular, built extraordinary institutions. Their own banks, their own newspapers, their own schools, their own cultural organizations. By 1913, Argentina's per capita GDP was comparable to that of France and higher than that of Sweden, which was beginning its own extraordinary development trajectory. Argentina was the world's largest exporter of beef, corn, and linseed. It was the 5th largest exporter of wheat. Buenos Aires was one of the great cities of the world, with a subway system more modern than those of many European capitals, an architecture of extraordinary ambition, and a cultural life that produced world-class literature, music, and intellectual discourse. The political system, by the standard of the era, was functioning. The 1912 signs paint a law introduced universal male suffrage and the secret ballot, a democratic advance that placed Argentina ahead of many European countries. The Radical Civil Union, the first genuinely mass political party in Argentine history, came to power in 1916 under Hipólito Yrigoyen, a charismatic figure who represented the first genuine transfer of power from the old landowning elite to a broader middle-class democratic coalition. So what went wrong? The first answer is commodity dependence. Argentina's extraordinary wealth was almost entirely based on agricultural exports: beef, wheat, corn, wool. This was wealth extracted from the land by relatively few people and exported to Europe. It was not the wealth of industrialization, of manufacturing, of a diversified economy. When commodity prices fell, as they did dramatically after World War I, and catastrophically during the Great Depression, Argentina's revenues collapsed. The second answer is the nature of its elite, the landowning class. The estancieros who owned the great cattle ranches and wheat farms of the Pampas were not industrial capitalists with an interest in developing domestic manufacturing. They were rentiers who extracted wealth from land and exported it. They had no interest in tariffs that would have protected domestic industry, because tariffs would have raised the prices of the imported manufactured goods they consumed. The Argentine economy was organized from its inception around exporting raw materials and importing finished goods, a model that created wealth for a few, employed relatively few workers, and left the broader population dependent on wages in an economy with limited industrial development. The third answer, and perhaps the most important, is the structural role of the state that emerged from the Argentine experience. Argentina's federal government, from its earliest days, was understood by all political actors not as a neutral arbiter of rules, but as a prize to be captured. Whoever controlled the federal government controlled the tariff, the currency, the patronage system, the public employment that was the economic lifeblood of many communities. Politics in Argentina was not about competing visions of the common good. It was about capturing the state and distributing its resources to your coalition. This pattern, once established, proved extraordinarily durable. The Great Depression hit Argentina with devastating force. Between 1929 and 1932, Argentine export earnings fell by more than 40%. The government's tax revenues, which depended heavily on trade, collapsed. The British pound left the gold standard in 1931, and Argentina, whose trade and financial relationships were overwhelmingly with Britain, faced a currency crisis. In 1930, Argentina's first military coup since the 19th century overthrew Uruguayan's democratically elected government, inaugurating a pattern of military intervention in politics that would persist with interruptions for the next 5 decades. The golden age was over. What replaced it would prove to be something much more complicated, much more painful, and much more instructive. No figure in Argentine history is more important, more controversial, or more responsible for the structural economic problems that persist to this day than one Domingo Perón. He was a military officer who came to prominence in the 1943 coup, became Minister of Labor, built a mass political movement through the labor unions, was briefly imprisoned by his rivals in the military, and was rescued from prison by a massive popular demonstration in October 1945 organized in part by his charismatic companion Eva Duarte, who would become the world-famous Evita. Perón was elected president in 1946 by an enormous margin. He governed until 1955, when he was overthrown by another military coup. He went into exile for 18 years, returned to Argentina briefly, died in office in 1974, and even today, the political movement he created divides Argentina more profoundly than any other force in the country's history. The two dominant political coalitions in contemporary Argentina are effectively the Peronists and the anti-Peronists. For 70 years, this binary has structured Argentine politics in ways that would be extraordinary in any other country. Why does Perón matter so much? Because he established the economic model that Argentina has been trying and failing to escape ever since. Perón was a nationalist and a populist in the original and most precise senses of those words. He believed that Argentina's wealth had been extracted by foreign capitalists, primarily British and by the domestic landed elite, and that this wealth should be redistributed to the Argentine working class through the state. He nationalized the British-owned railways. He nationalized the telephone company. He nationalized the central bank. He nationalized the grain export trade. He created a state purchasing agency, IAPI, that bought grain from farmers at below market prices and sold it on international markets at market prices, using the difference to subsidize urban workers and fund his ambitious social programs. He expanded public employment dramatically. He created an elaborate system of union protections, minimum wages, paid vacations, Christmas bonuses, and social benefits that made the Argentine working class genuinely better off in material terms than had been before. Evita's foundation distributed sewing machines, food, medicine, and housing to the poor with an extraordinary theatrical flair that combined genuine charitable impulse with brilliant political marketing. The early years of Peronism were, by many measures, successful. Argentina in the late 1940s was riding a post-war commodity boom. Argentine beef and grain were in high demand from a recovering Europe. The government had accumulated substantial reserves during the war years when it had exported food to both sides. The redistribution of this accumulated wealth toward the working class produced genuine improvements in living standards, genuine increases in union power, genuine advances in access to education and health care. But the model had a fatal flaw, or rather, several fatal flaws that compounded each other over time. The first was the treatment of agriculture. By fixing the exchange rate at an overvalued level and using IAPI to extract value from the agricultural sector, Perón effectively taxed the sector that produced Argentina's export revenues. Farmers received less than world market prices for their crops. The incentive to invest in agricultural productivity declined. The cattle herd declined. Wheat production declined. And as agricultural exports declined, the foreign exchange earnings that funded Argentina's ability to import declined with them. The second was a failure to build a competitive industrial base. Perón protected Argentine industry through high tariffs, but protected industry that cannot compete internationally is not an engine of wealth creation. It is a mechanism for transferring income from consumers, who pay higher prices for domestically produced goods, to the workers and owners of protected industries. Argentine manufacturing during the Perón years produced goods that were significantly more expensive and often lower quality than what could have been imported. The economy became less efficient over time, not more. The third was a fundamental dynamic of populist politics itself. Having promised so much to so many people, Perón found it politically impossible to cut spending when the economic circumstances demanded it. When export revenues fell in the early 1950s, when the reserve position deteriorated, when inflation began to accelerate, the politically rational response was to print money to maintain the spending commitments rather than reduce them and face the political consequences. By 1952, Argentina was in economic crisis. Inflation was running at 36% per year. The balance of payments was deeply negative. Perón announced an austerity program that he called the Economic Plan of 1952. He asked Argentines to sacrifice. The austerity was real, and it stabilized the economy somewhat. But the damage had been done. The pattern had been established. When Perón was overthrown in 1955, the military that replaced him found an economy that was structurally weaker than it had been in 1946. With a working class that had been promised entitlements it would fight fiercely to protect, and a political movement that would remain the dominant force in Argentine politics, whether it was in or out of power. The Peronist movement's genius and its curse was the same thing. It created an identity. To be Peronist was not just to support a set of policies. It was to be part of a family, a tribe, a movement that gave meaning and solidarity and belonging to millions of Argentines who had previously been excluded from political and economic life. That identity proved impervious to economic failure. No matter how many times Peronism produced economic disaster, the movement survived because it spoke to something deeper than economic calculation. What followed Perón's overthrow was not the stable democratic capitalism that the coup's organizers promised. It was instead a period of extraordinary political instability in which Argentina ricocheted between elected governments and military dictatorships, between Peronist governments and anti-Peronist governments, between brief economic stabilizations and renewed collapses, in a pattern so exhausting and so destructive that it produced one of the most brutal episodes in Latin American history. Between 1955 and 1983, Argentina had 23 different presidents. The average tenure was less than 18 months. Some lasted weeks. Some lasted days. Military coups, counter-coups, and the resignation of civilian governments that had lost the confidence of the military succeeded each other with disorienting frequency. The country simply could not agree on who should rule it or on what terms. The economic consequences of this instability were severe and cumulative. Each government that came to power inherited the economic mess of its predecessor and attempted to fix it through a combination of stabilization programs and political payoffs to its own constituency. When the stabilization programs worked, they created the conditions for the next government to reverse them in the name of growth and social justice. When they failed, they created the conditions for another coup. The period of military dictatorship from 1966 to 1973 brought technocratic economic management and some stabilization, but also social repression that generated the guerrilla movements that would plunge Argentina into political violence. The Peronist left, in the form of the Montoneros, and the Marxist People's Revolutionary Army engaged in bombings, assassinations, kidnappings, and bank robberies. The security forces responded with kidnappings, torture, and murder of their own. Perón returned from exile in 1973 to enormous popular enthusiasm. He was 77 years old, in declining health, and surrounded by advisors whose factions despised each other. The Peronist movement had by this point divided into a left wing and a right wing so incompatible that they were shooting each other. At Ezeiza Airport, when hundreds of thousands gathered to welcome Perón's plane, Peronist gunmen fired on the crowd from a viewing platform, killing dozens in a scene of horror that encapsulated the movement's internal fractures. Perón died in office in July 1974. His third wife, Isabel, who was also his vice president, took office. She was completely out of her depth. The economy was in crisis, with inflation approaching 300% by 1975. A particularly catastrophic episode occurred in June 1975, when Economy Minister Celestino Rodrigo announced a massive devaluation and price adjustment that came to be known as the Rodrigazzo. Prices on fuel and transportation increased by 100 to 180% overnight. The resulting social explosion forced Rodrigo's resignation within weeks. By 1976, with inflation out of control, guerrilla violence continuing, and the government manifestly unable to maintain order, the military staged its coup. General Jorge Rafael Videla took power. What followed was the dirtiest war in Argentine history. Between 1976 and 1983, the military dictatorship systematically kidnapped, tortured, and murdered between 10,000 and 30,000 people. The precise number remains disputed, but the scale of the atrocity is not. Many of the disappeared, as they came to be called, were thrown from aircraft into the Rio de la Plata. Pregnant women were murdered after giving birth, their babies given to military families to raise. The torture centers operated throughout the country. The mothers of the Plaza de Mayo began their silent weekly vigils, circling the central plaza in Buenos Aires with photographs of their missing children, the most powerful and enduring image of resistance to state terror in Latin American history. The military's economic management was not uniformly disastrous in its early years. Economy Minister José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz attempted a genuine liberalization of the economy, reducing tariffs, opening capital markets, and attracting foreign debt. But the liberalization was selective and ultimately incoherent. The exchange rate was kept overvalued, which encouraged Argentines to borrow in dollars and import heavily, a strategy known as plata dulce or sweet money, while gutting the domestic manufacturing sector. When the external debt crisis of 1982 struck, as commodity prices fell and U.S. interest rates rose, Argentina's dollar debt became unsustainable. The military government's final gamble was the Falklands War. In April 1982, Argentine forces invaded and occupied the Falkland Islands, a British territory in the South Atlantic that Argentina called the Malvinas. The generals calculated that Britain would negotiate rather than fight, and that a successful territorial acquisition would restore the military's domestic legitimacy. They miscalculated catastrophically. Britain sent a naval task force, retook the islands in 10 weeks, and the Argentine military surrendered in June 1982. The humiliation was complete. The military had presided over massive human rights abuses, had destroyed the economy through a combination of repression and incoherent policy, and had now been militarily defeated in a war they had initiated. They had no remaining legitimacy of any kind. Democratic elections were held in October 1983. Raúl Alfonsín, the candidate of the Radical Civil Union, won by a wider margin than anyone expected. The military era left behind an economy in ruins, a society traumatized by years of political violence, a foreign debt that had exploded from $8 billion in 1976 to $46 billion in 1983, and an annual inflation rate approaching 400%. Raúl Alfonsín deserves enormous credit for what he accomplished. He restored democracy to Argentina. He pursued accountability for the crimes of the military dictatorship, putting the junta commanders on trial in a proceeding that was remarkable for a Latin American country in 1985. He established civilian control of the military in a context where the military had every incentive to resist. These were genuine achievements of extraordinary political courage. His economic management was not a success. This was not entirely his fault. He inherited a catastrophe. The foreign debt was enormous and impossible to service honestly. The structural deficits of the Argentine state, were deeply embedded. The political system, in which the Peronist Party controlled most provincial governments and trade unions and was determined to obstruct any austerity that threatened its constituencies, made reform extraordinarily difficult. Alfonsín attempted several economic stabilization programs. The most ambitious was the Austral Plan of 1985, which introduced a new currency. The Austral replaced the peso, established a fixed exchange rate, implemented wage and price controls, and attempted to break the inflationary psychology through a bold, coordinated shock. It worked for a while. Inflation fell dramatically. The economy stabilized. But the Austral Plan's success required fiscal discipline that the political system could not sustain. The provincial governments continued spending. The state enterprises continued their losses. The military, though politically diminished, still commanded significant budget resources. The unions resisted wage restraint. The plan gradually unraveled. By 1989, with Alfonsín preparing to hand over power to his elected successor, Carlos Menem of the Peronist Party, the economy had entered a hyperinflationary spiral. Monthly inflation rates reached double digits. Annual inflation hit 3,079% in 1989. This is not a number that can be made comprehensible through simple repetition. 3,079% annual inflation means that a basket of goods that cost 100 pesos in January costs 3,179 pesos by December. It means that anyone holding pesos was watching their purchasing power dissolve in real time. It means that the system of prices and contracts and economic calculation that normal economic life depends on had completely broken down. The crisis produced food riots. Supermarkets were looted in several cities. People died. Alfonsín handed power to Menem 5 months early, in July 1989, because the situation was simply beyond his capacity to manage. The hyperinflation of 1989 to 1990 was one of the most traumatic collective economic experiences in Argentine history. For the generation that lived through it, it established a visceral understanding of what currency collapse feels like, what it means to have your savings destroyed by forces you cannot control or predict, and why the dollar, stable, solid American dollars, was the only real money. Carlos Menem was, by any conventional measure, an extraordinary political operator. He had campaigned as a traditional Peronist, promising social justice and economic nationalism. Once in office, he governed as a market liberalizer, implementing reforms that no Peronist politician was supposed to be able to implement. He privatized state enterprises that had been sacrosanct Peronist patrimony. He reduced tariffs. He reformed labor markets, partially. He was shameless in his pragmatism and utterly unconcerned with ideological consistency. His most important move was the appointment of Domingo Cavallo as economy minister in 1991. And Cavallo's most important move was the convertibility plan. The convertibility plan was simple, radical, and brilliant in its logic. By law, actual legislation, not just a government decree, the Argentine peso was fixed to the U.S. dollar at a rate of exactly 1-to-1. 1 peso equaled $1. The central bank was required by law to hold dollar reserves equal to the monetary base. It could not print pesos unless it had the dollars to back them. The entire inflationary mechanism of the Argentine state, printing money to finance deficits, was legally prohibited. The result was extraordinary. Inflation collapsed from 2,314% in 1990 to 84% in 1991, to 18% in 1992, to 7% in 1993, to essentially zero by 1994. After decades of double and triple-digit inflation, Argentines experienced price stability. The economy boomed. GDP grew at rates approaching 10% per year in the early 1990s. The middle class expanded. Consumer credit appeared. People began to invest and plan for the future in ways that had been impossible during the inflation years. The decade of the 1990s in Argentina was, for the middle class and the business community, a period of genuine prosperity and optimism. For anyone who had lived through the hyperinflation, the contrast was almost surreal. Prices were stable. The peso was solid. You could literally convert to dollars at any bank at a 1-to-1 rate. People renovated their homes, bought cars, traveled abroad. Buenos Aires felt in the mid-1990s, like a city that had rediscovered its Belle Epoque confidence. But the convertibility plan had a structural flaw that became more visible over time. By fixing the peso to the dollar, Argentina had also fixed its competitiveness relative to any country whose currency moved against the dollar. In the mid-1990s, the dollar was relatively weak. This was manageable. But in the late 1990s, the dollar strengthened significantly. This meant that Argentine exports became more expensive and less competitive at exactly the same time that Brazil, Argentina's largest trading partner, devalued its currency in 1999, making Brazilian exports much cheaper than Argentine ones. The Argentine economy had also borrowed enormously in dollars throughout the 1990s. The banking system was dollarized. Companies borrowed in dollars. The government borrowed in dollars. Mortgages were in dollars. When the economy weakened and the budget deficit widened, the government could not print money to finance the deficit. That was prohibited by the convertibility law. It could only borrow more, and it borrowed more and more, at interest rates that rose as creditors became increasingly nervous about Argentina's ability to repay. The late 1990s were years of recession in Argentina, as the strong dollar, the Brazilian devaluation, and falling commodity prices combined to squeeze the economy. Unemployment rose. The fiscal deficit widened. The debt burden grew. The IMF provided successive bailout packages in 1998, 2000, and 2001, each conditioned on austerity measures that deepened the recession, reduced tax revenues, and made the debt dynamics worse rather than better. By late 2001, the system had become mathematically unsustainable. The debt was too large to service honestly. The economy was shrinking. The unemployment rate had reached 20%, and ordinary Argentines, sensing the coming collapse, were withdrawing their savings from the banking system and converting them to dollars or transferring them abroad. The end came suddenly, as these things always do, even when they've been visibly coming for years. In November 2001, Economy Minister Domingo Cavallo, brought back for a second stint in a desperate attempt to restore confidence, announced a corralito. The corralito was a restriction on bank withdrawals. Argentines could withdraw no more than $250 per week from their bank accounts. Accounts could not be transferred abroad. The little fence had been placed around the savings of the Argentine people. The corralito was justified as a measure to prevent a bank run and give the system time to stabilize. In practice, it was the government telling ordinary people who had played by the rules, who had saved their money in banks as they were supposed to, who had trusted the financial system, that their money was now not really their money. It was an act of desperation that destroyed whatever remained of public trust in the system. The rage was immediate and volcanic. On December 19th and 20th, 2001, Argentina exploded. Pots and pans were banged in middle-class neighborhoods. The famous Casalazzo, the protest of people who had never protested but were now on the streets because they had nothing left to lose. Supermarkets were looted. Banks were attacked. Police fired rubber bullets and live ammunition. By the end of the 2 days, at least 30 people had died. President Fernando de la Rúa resigned and fled to Casa Rosada by helicopter. What followed was a sequence of events so extraordinary that even Argentines who lived through it sometimes have trouble believing it happened. Between December 20th, 2001 and January 2nd, 2002, Argentina had 5 different presidents. Adolfo Rodriguez SAA, appointed by the legislature as interim president, announced the largest sovereign debt default in history, $100 billion, to enormous popular acclaim. He resigned a week later, unable to form a functioning government. Eduardo Duhalde, a Peronist former vice president, was eventually confirmed by the legislature as president in early January. Duhalde ended the convertibility. The peso, which had been fixed at 1-to-1 with the dollar since 1991, was devalued. But because the banking system was dollarized, most loans and deposits were in dollars, the devaluation created an immediate problem. The government resolved it through pacification. Dollar deposits were converted to pesos at a rate of 1.4-to-1. Dollar debts were converted to pesos at 1-to-1. The asymmetry was designed to benefit debtors at the expense of savers. People who had saved dollars in Argentine banks found that their dollars had become pesos, and quickly devaluing pesos at that. The peso fell from 1 to the dollar to 4 to the dollar within months. A deposit that had been $10,000 in December 2001 was, by June 2002, worth $2,500 at the new exchange rate. The savings of the Argentine middle class had been reduced to a quarter of their previous value. The trust in banks, in the currency, in the financial system was destroyed for a generation. The unemployment rate reached 25% by mid-2002. More than half the population was below the poverty line. The economy had contracted by nearly 11% in 2002 alone. This was not a recession. It was a depression, as severe relative to Argentina's own history as the Great Depression had been for the United States. Nestor Kirchner came to power in May 2003 with 22% of the vote. He became president because his opponent, Carlos Menem, withdrew from a runoff rather than face certain defeat. He governed until 2007, when his wife Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner succeeded him. Cristina governed until 2015. Together, the Kirchner era lasted 12 years and represents perhaps the most consequential period in modern Argentine economic history. The early years of Nestor Kirchner's government benefited from a remarkable alignment of favorable circumstances. The devaluation had made Argentine exports cheap and competitive again. The commodity supercycle of the 2000s, driven by Chinese demand for food and raw materials, sent soybean and beef prices to historic highs. Argentina's agricultural sector, free from the overvalued peso that had throttled it during the convertibility era, boomed. Tax revenues, particularly from the export tax on soybeans that Kirchner introduced, flooded into the treasury. Kirchner negotiated Argentina's debt restructuring. The default had still not been resolved, and achieved terms that imposed a haircut of approximately 70% on creditors. By any measure, this was an extraordinary negotiating outcome. Argentina's debt burden was dramatically reduced. Combined with a commodity revenue windfall, this gave Kirchner the fiscal space to increase social spending, raise public sector wages, expand public employment, and fund a genuine economic recovery. The economy grew strongly. Poverty fell. The middle class recovered. Real wages rose. Public investment in infrastructure increased. Kirchner was enormously popular, and his popularity was not built on illusion. The material improvement in the lives of ordinary Argentines during his presidency was real, but the structural problems were being rebuilt rather than resolved. The government's fiscal position was critically dependent on export taxes on soybeans. When soybean prices were high, the tax revenues were substantial. When they fell, the revenues fell with them. This was a dangerous concentration of fiscal risk in a single commodity. It was also politically explosive. The landowning class resented the export taxes deeply, viewing them as a modern equivalent of the IAPI extractions of the Perón era. In 2008, a dispute over a proposed increase in export taxes produced a 4-month political crisis and an agricultural strike that revealed how fragile the government's coalition was. The government's response to any fiscal pressure was to expand spending rather than contain it. Public employment grew dramatically. Subsidies for energy and transportation were expanded to the point where the subsidy bill became one of the largest items in the national budget. State enterprises that had been privatized in the 1990s were renationalized. The airline, the pension funds, the oil company YPF, all brought back under state control. The central bank's independence was progressively reduced. The central bank was instructed to transfer reserves to the Treasury to help fund spending. Statistics began to be manipulated. The official inflation figures produced by the Index Statistics Institute, which had previously been internationally respected, were systematically understated from 2007 onward. The real inflation rate, measured by provincial statistics offices and independent economists, was running at 2 to 3 times the official figure. The government attacked independent economists who published alternative inflation estimates, finding them and threatening legal action. When official statistics are falsified, the economy becomes impossible to manage rationally. Wage negotiations are conducted using false inflation data, so real wages are set incorrectly. Bond payments that are indexed to inflation use false figures, effectively defaulting on the real value of the obligations. The budget is constructed on false assumptions. The policy framework becomes unmoored from reality. Cristina Kirchner's second term, from 2011 to 2015, saw the contradictions of the model become increasingly acute. The commodity boom was ending. The energy subsidies had created an extraordinary perverse dynamic in which Argentines paid some of the cheapest energy prices in the world, while the government spent billions of dollars importing energy that domestic production, discouraged by price controls, could not supply. Argentina, which had been an energy exporter in the early 2000s, had become an energy importer at enormous fiscal cost. The balance of payments came under pressure. Capital controls were imposed to prevent dollar outflow. A parallel exchange rate market emerged, the blue dollar, or dollar blue, at which dollars traded at a substantial premium to the official rate. The gap between the official and parallel rates became a reliable indicator of the government's credibility. By 2015, the parallel rate was roughly double the official rate. Inflation, which the official statistics said was in single digits, was actually running at 25 to 30% per year. The subsidies bill was consuming an ever larger share of the budget. The fiscal deficit was being financed by central bank money printing. The seeds of the next inflation crisis were being planted with the same compulsive regularity that had planted them every previous time. Mauricio Macri won the 2015 presidential election promising what Argentina's economic reform advocates had always promised: an end to the Kirchner's distortions, a normalization of the economy, a return to international capital markets, a reduction in inflation. Macri was a businessman, the former president of the Boca Juniors football club, wealthy and urbane, and connected to the Buenos Aires establishment in ways that made the Kirchnerist movement despise him. His government made some genuine reforms. It reached a settlement with the holdout creditors who had refused to participate in the 2005 and 2010 debt restructurings, the so-called vulture funds, and returned Argentina to international capital markets. It removed the exchange rate controls. It reduced some subsidies, resulting in dramatic increases in utility bills that hit consumers hard. It restored independence to the Statistics Institute and began publishing accurate inflation data. But the reforms were gradual rather than comprehensive. Macri was governing in a democracy with strong opposition from Peronist-controlled provinces, Peronist-aligned unions, and a political culture that would not accept rapid austerity. He chose to finance the transition period with borrowing rather than immediate fiscal adjustment, calculating that growth would eventually close the fiscal gap. This calculation proved fatal. In 2018, as U.S. interest rates rose and the dollar strengthened, emerging market currencies came under pressure globally. Argentina, which had borrowed heavily in dollars to finance its deficit, was exposed. The peso began to fall. The fall accelerated. The central bank burned through reserves defending the currency without success. By mid-2018, the peso had lost more than half its value against the dollar. In desperation, Macri went to the IMF and negotiated the largest IMF program in the institution's history, a $57 billion standby arrangement. The IMF program required fiscal adjustment, reducing the deficit. In exchange for the funding, Macri implemented the adjustment, which deepened the recession. His approval ratings collapsed. The Peronist opposition, led by Cristina Kirchner herself as vice presidential candidate alongside Alberto Fernandez as presidential nominee, won the 2019 election comfortably. Macri's failure is instructive. It suggests that even well-intentioned reform of the Argentine economy runs into structural obstacles that are not primarily economic. They are political. The constituencies that benefit from deficit spending, subsidies, and public employment are powerful enough to block any government that threatens their interests through ballot box, through street protests, or through the institutional obstruction that Argentina's federal system and its powerful unions enable. Argentina's problem is not that it lacks economists who understand what needs to be done. It is that the political system cannot implement what needs to be done without destroying the political coalition that supports any government that tries to do it. Alberto Fernandez's government began with an immediate debt restructuring. Argentina was already unable to service the debts incurred under Macri and was then hit by the COVID-19 pandemic, which provided both a genuine crisis and a convenient justification for expanding spending. The government's pandemic response was among the most restrictive in the world. Argentina implemented one of the longest and strictest lockdowns, shutting down the economy for months. The fiscal cost was enormous. The government spent heavily on income support for workers and businesses. The central bank printed pesos to finance the spending. Inflation, which had been running at 50% per year before the pandemic, accelerated. By 2021, annual inflation was 51%. By 2022, it was 94%. By 2023, it had reached 211%. In the final months of 2023, monthly inflation was running at over 20%, meaning that prices were more than doubling every 4 months. The government responded to inflation with the characteristic tools of Argentine economic management in crisis: multiple exchange rates, price controls, export restrictions, and denials that the inflation was as bad as the data suggested. Argentina, under Alberto Fernandez, had 3 economy ministers in the final year of his government alone, as each one attempted to stabilize a situation that was becoming more unmanageable by the month. The peso in the parallel market in late 2023 was trading at 4 or 5 times the official rate. The central bank had accumulated negative net reserves. It owed more in forward contracts than it held in actual dollars. The fiscal deficit was being financed almost entirely by central bank money printing. The situation was, by any objective measure, pre-crisis. And into this situation stepped Javier Milei. Javier Milei is not a normal politician. He is an economist by training, a libertarian by ideology, a self-described anarcho-capitalist by philosophical inclination, and a phenomenon by temperament. He campaigns with a chainsaw that he wields at rallies to symbolize his intention to cut the Argentine state. He calls himself El Loco, the crazy one. His hair is extraordinary. His rhetoric makes conventional conservative politicians sound like moderate social democrats. He won the presidential election of November 2023 with 55% of the vote against a traditional Peronist candidate. It was the largest margin of victory in a competitive Argentine presidential election in decades. He won because the country had literally run out of patience with the political class that had managed its economy into 211% inflation, 40% poverty, and negative central bank reserves. Milei's economic program was simple in concept and radical in practice. He immediately implemented a massive devaluation of the official peso, which had been kept artificially strong. He devalued by more than 50% overnight. He announced a comprehensive austerity program, cutting government spending by eliminating subsidies, reducing public sector employment, and freezing public investment. He eliminated or merged government ministries. He ended transfers to the provinces. He ended price controls. The austerity was severe enough that Argentina ran a primary fiscal surplus. Government revenues exceeded spending within months of Milei taking office. This had not happened in Argentina for decades. The central bank stopped printing money to finance the deficit because there was no longer a deficit to finance. The results were, in the short term, exactly what economic textbooks would predict. The fiscal adjustment worked in its own narrow terms. The deficit disappeared. But the human cost was enormous. Poverty, which had been around 40%, spiked to over 50% in early 2024. Real wages collapsed. The economy contracted significantly. People who were already poor became desperately poor. But inflation, which had been running at 25% per month in December 2023, fell steadily through 2024. By mid-2024, monthly inflation had fallen to the 5 to 7% range, still very high by any international standard, but dramatically lower than where it had been. The budget surplus persisted. The parallel exchange rate gap narrowed as confidence in the government's fiscal discipline grew. Whether Milei's experiment will succeed in the long run is genuinely unknown. He is attempting something that has never been tried at this scale in a large democracy with Argentina's institutional characteristics. The social cost of the adjustment has been severe. The political coalition behind a reform is narrow. The institutional obstacles, Peronist governors, Peronist-aligned courts, Peronist unions, are still in place. And if the reform fails, if the inevitable political and social pressures force an abandonment of fiscal discipline, the loop will begin again. As it has before, we have traced the history. Now we need to understand the mechanism. Why does this keep happening? What is the suicide loop exactly? And why has Argentina been unable to escape it? The answer requires understanding several interlocking factors that reinforce each other. The first factor is the structure of Argentine politics. Argentina has a political system built around the capture and distribution of state resources. Every major political coalition, Peronist and anti-Peronist, maintains power through patronage networks that require continuous flows of government money. Public employment is a political instrument. Subsidies are a political instrument. Public works contracts are a political instrument. The state is not a neutral provider of public goods. It is a prize that political coalitions fight to control and a mechanism through which they reward their supporters. This means that fiscal discipline is always politically costly. Any government that cuts spending is reducing the flows that maintain its coalition. Any government that raises taxes is threatening the economic interests of some constituency. The politically rational course of action for any Argentine government facing fiscal pressure is to borrow, to print money, or to impose capital controls rather than make the politically costly adjustments that long-term fiscal sustainability requires. The second factor is the fragility of the currency. Because Argentina has experienced so many currency crises, because the peso has been devalued so many times, because inflation has been so severe for so long, Argentines have rationally concluded that the peso is not a reliable store of value. They hold their savings in dollars. They price major transactions in dollars. They think about their wealth in dollars. This dollarization of the Argentine economy is rational at the individual level, but catastrophic at the systemic level. When Argentines convert their pesos to dollars, they are reducing the demand for pesos, which puts downward pressure on the peso. When the peso weakens, inflation rises, because imported goods become more expensive. When inflation rises, Argentines rush to convert more pesos to dollars. The dynamic is self-reinforcing and extremely difficult to break. The third factor is a pattern of debt accumulation and default. Argentina has defaulted on its external debt 9 times. Each default is preceded by a period of borrowing. International creditors, for reasons that baffle outside observers, keep lending to Argentina despite its default history. Why? Because the yields on Argentine debt are extremely high, reflecting the risk. And in periods of global financial excess, when investors are searching for yield, they accept the risk. But each borrowing cycle ends the same way. The debt accumulates. The interest payments become unsustainable. The government is unable or unwilling to make the fiscal adjustments needed to service the debt honestly. A crisis occurs. The creditors take a haircut. The debt is restructured. And the cycle begins again with the next generation of creditors who believe this time will be different. The fourth factor is the political economy of inflation itself. Inflation is not just an economic problem. It is the political mechanism. Inflation is, in effect, a tax on holders of pesos. It reduces the real value of their money holdings. But unlike a conventional tax, it does not require a parliamentary vote. It does not require explicit political decisions. It simply happens, and by the time the public understands what has happened, the resources have already been transferred from peso holders to the government. For governments with large fiscal deficits and limited access to bond markets, inflation is a tempting tool. It allows spending to continue beyond revenues without the politically explosive act of explicit tax increases or explicit spending cuts. The bill is paid by ordinary savers, by workers whose wages lag behind prices, by pensioners whose fixed incomes decline in real terms. These are precisely the people who have the least political power and the least ability to protect themselves. The fifth factor is what we might call the institutional weakness trap. Institutions, central bank independence, independent statistics agencies, rule of law, property rights protection, are the mechanisms through which modern economies maintain economic stability. They work by constraining the short-term political interests of whoever is in power and service of long-term economic stability. Argentina's institutions are weak by developed world standards. The central bank is politically dependent. The statistics agency was corrupted under Kirchner. The judiciary is subject to political manipulation. This institutional weakness means that every stabilization plan rests ultimately on the political will of whoever is in power, rather than on embedded institutional constraints. And political will in Argentina is famously finite. The sixth and perhaps most profound factor is what we might call the Argentine social contract problem. Peronism created an expectation among the Argentine working class and the poor that the state would guarantee their welfare, that wages would be protected, that employment would be protected, that the cost of living would be subsidized. This expectation is deeply embedded in Argentine political culture. When governments try to reform by reducing subsidies, adjusting the exchange rate, or cutting public employment, they collide with these expectations. The response is typically street protests, strikes, and eventually electoral punishment. Governments that pursue reform are voted out. Governments that abandon reform are voted in. The loop continues. Argentina is not just a tragedy. It is a laboratory. A uniquely terrible, uniquely instructive laboratory in which every failure mode of monetary policy, every consequence of institutional weakness, every result of political short-termism has been tested at scale on a real population of real people. And from this laboratory, there are lessons that apply to everyone, regardless of where you live. Lesson 1. Currency is a promise, not a fact. The Argentine peso has been redenominated multiple times. 1 peso today is worth what was once 10 trillion old pesos before various conversions. Every time the government said the currency was stable, it was eventually proven unstable. This is a lesson that Argentines learn through painful experience, and that people in other countries have the luxury of learning from Argentina's experience rather than their own. Paper money is a promise. Promises can be broken. Plan accordingly. Lesson 2. Diversification across currencies and assets is not paranoia. It is basic financial literacy. Every Argentine who had a significant portion of their savings in actual physical dollars, or in assets denominated in dollars and held outside Argentina, survived the 2001 collapse and the subsequent collapses much better than those who had their savings entirely in pesos and Argentine banks. This lesson: hold some of your savings in a form that cannot be inflated, devalued, or frozen by your government, is one that Argentines understand viscerally and that people in stable countries tend to dismiss as paranoid. Argentina suggests it is not paranoid. It is prudent. Lesson 3. Watch what the government does, not what it says. Every Argentine government that produced an economic crisis gave warnings in its data long before the crisis arrived. The official statistics were understated, but the parallel exchange rate premium, the trade balance, the reserve position, the fiscal deficit, these data points told the story of impending crisis before the crisis arrived. People who were paying attention to the data rather than the official narrative had time to protect themselves. People who trusted the official narrative did not. Lesson 4. Institutional quality is an economic asset of the first order. The reason Argentina keeps repeating the loop while Australia, Canada, and New Zealand, which had comparable natural endowments and immigrant populations in the 19th century, have not, is primarily institutional. Australia and Canada developed strong, independent institutions, a central bank that is not subject to political instruction, statistics agencies that cannot be corrupted, a rule of law that applies equally to political actors and private citizens. These institutions are not exciting. They do not produce great political speeches or dramatic historical moments, but they prevent the kind of crisis that Argentina has experienced repeatedly, and they allow ordinary people to plan their lives without fear of sudden currency collapse. Lesson 5. The relationship between citizens and their governments matters economically. Societies that develop a culture of mutual obligation between citizens and the state, where citizens pay taxes and the state provides reliable services and stable institutions, function better economically than societies where the state is seen as a prize to be captured and a resource to be extracted. Argentina's political culture has long treated the state primarily as a source of patronage. The consequence is a state that is simultaneously too large, too many employees, too many subsidies, and too weak, incapable of providing reliable services or maintaining institutional integrity. Lesson 6. Inflation is a political choice. The argument that inflation is an uncontrollable natural phenomenon, like the weather or an earthquake, is false. Inflation at Argentine levels is the consequence of specific political decisions to finance deficits by printing money, to maintain exchange rate overvaluation, to suppress official statistics. These decisions are made by people who benefit from them in the short term. The victims are the savers, the workers, and the poor. Understanding inflation as a political choice rather than a natural phenomenon changes how you respond to it. Whether Argentina under Milei will finally escape the loop is one of the most important questions in contemporary economics. The stakes are not just Argentine, they are global. Because if Argentina manages to break a pattern that has persisted for 70 years, it will represent genuine evidence that the loop can be broken. And if it fails, it will confirm the most pessimistic assessments of the difficulty of structural economic reform in countries with Argentina's characteristics. The optimistic case for Milei's success rests on several pillars. The fiscal surplus is real. The reduction in monetary financing of the deficit is real. Inflation, while still very high, is declining. The parallel exchange rate gap has narrowed. There are genuine signs that the adjustment is working in the narrow fiscal sense. But the optimistic case has to contend with several serious challenges. Milei's coalition is narrow. He does not control the Argentine Congress. He cannot pass major legislation without support from other parties. The social cost of the adjustment is severe, and the human suffering it is producing creates political pressure for reversal. The economy is in recession. Poverty has increased. The middle class is squeezed. And beneath all of this, the structural factors that created the loop are still present. The patronage-based political culture, the currency distrust, the institutional weaknesses, the deeply embedded expectations about the state's role in providing economic security. These are not things that a charismatic economist with a chainsaw can eliminate in a year or two. The most honest answer about Argentina's future is, nobody knows. Economists have been wrong about Argentina repeatedly in both directions. Those who predicted permanent collapse in 2002 were wrong. The country recovered substantially under Kirchner. Those who predicted that convertibility would produce permanent stability were wrong. It collapsed in 2001. Those who predicted that Kirchnerism would produce another hyperinflation were eventually proven right, but later than many expected. What Argentina's history does suggest, with considerable force, is that optimism about the country's economic future should always be tempered by awareness of the structural forces that have repeatedly undermined previous recoveries. The loop has a remarkable resilience. Breaking it requires not just the right economic policies, but a transformation of the political incentives and institutional structures that keep recreating it. Argentina's story is extraordinary. It is also, in crucial ways, a mirror in which we can see reflections of tendencies and vulnerabilities that exist to varying degrees in every modern economy. Every modern government faces a temptation to spend beyond its revenues and finance the difference by printing money or borrowing from creditors who will eventually want to be repaid. Every modern political system has constituencies that benefit from government spending and will resist any cuts to their benefits. Every modern central bank faces political pressure to accommodate fiscal deficits rather than maintain the monetary discipline that contains inflation. Every modern democracy struggles with the gap between what voters want in the short term and what the economy can sustainably provide. Argentina is not a cautionary tale about a bizarre and unique society that is incomprehensibly addicted to self-destruction. It is a cautionary tale about what happens when these universal tendencies are allowed to compound over time without the institutional constraints and the political culture that keep them in check. When you watch Argentina, you are watching an extreme version of dynamics that exist everywhere. The extreme version is useful precisely because it makes the consequences so clear, so undeniable, so impossible to ignore. In countries with stronger institutions, the same tendencies produce slower, more subtle, more deniable forms of the same problems. In Argentina, they produce 211% inflation and 5 presidents in 2 weeks. The countries that have avoided the Argentine outcome have done so not because they lack the political pressures that produce it, but because they have built institutions and cultures that resist those pressures more effectively. That resistance is not automatic or permanent. It requires active maintenance, vigilant citizens, and political leaders who are willing to make unpopular decisions in service of long-term stability. Argentina, having failed this test repeatedly, is trying once again. The attempt is genuine, the commitment of the current government real, the early results in some respects encouraging. But the history is sobering. The loop has broken many reformers before. Whether it will break this one, or whether this one will break the loop, is a question that will define Argentina's 21st century. And the answer will matter not just to Argentines, but to everyone watching from outside who understands that the distance between stability and the suicide loop is smaller than comfortable. If this deep dive into Argentina's extraordinary economic history gave you a new framework for understanding money, inflation, and the relationship between politics and economic stability, hit that like button. The algorithm buries long-form economic history because it does not fit the 30-second format. Your engagement is what makes this kind of content viable. Subscribe if you want to keep following the money through history and into the present. And tell me in the comments, do you think Milei will succeed? Is Argentina finally breaking the loop? Or will history repeat itself one more time? I want your analysis. Stay skeptical, stay informed, and keep watching.